Here in semi-rural Canada, where I try to make YouTube videos for you guys, I spend a lot of my time without electricity. Over the last few years, I'd say I've spent about 5% of my time without electricity, about 1 day in 20. And on these days, one of the main things I like to do is look over my copies of The War Illustrated. The War Illustrated is fascinating because you'll get accounts from the beginning of the war that make it sound like a sporting event. You'll find all sorts of antiquated beliefs that have been swept under the rug of history. And you'll find incongruencies with the histories of today. Even the fact that it was heavily censored by what would later become the Ministry of Information, even this helps add to its mystique and the chances of finding a new discovery on every page. For example, today I learned that World War I was a fight against communism and Adolf Hitler was fighting on the side of Karl Marx. Sargon of Akkad recently did a video which was a critique of German culture, encapsulated in a response to Free Arrows, a socialist German YouTuber. And while I listened to Sargon's ideas, I didn't fully agree with him. However, I think the articles I'm going to read today would agree with Sargon's thesis. The real triumph of German culture. With the exception of the Turks, we British are the most lazy-minded race that ever climbed to imperial power. To the force of large, new, foreign ideas, we are remarkably impregnable. Sometimes this defect is one of the sources of our strength, a way of preserving our national character. We fought Napoleon without recognizing what Napoleon stood for. We are now fighting the German emperor with no clear conception of the great idea he represents. But this time, the enemy's idea will prevail upon us. As yet, this culture, of which the Germans proclaim themselves the warrior missionaries, has little meaning for us. But since the Arabs rose across the world to spread their new creed at sword's point, no such outburst of fanaticism has been seen as that against which we are now contending. The wars of religion, ensuing on the Reformation begun by Luther, were not so generally important as the war in which we are now engaged. What is the nature of this extraordinary culture that has inspired a nation largely composed of the great-grandchildren of serfs to fierce, aggressive action? It entirely occupies the place of religion in the minds of many notable Germans. It is, in fact, a religion, a political religion. First of all modern countries, Germany has created the great state. Not since the fall of the empires of the Incas of Peru has such a thing been done. Moreover, the German achievement in practical socialism was based on a mighty warlike power. The leaders of the professed Social Democratic Party had many matters in dispute with their warrior caste. But these matters related to the domestic development of the great state. When the war for dominion opened, the Social Democrats, with few exceptions, rallied to the aid of their military chiefs. Even the trail of slaughter and ruin in Belgium and northwestern France did not disturb the conscience of the disciples of Karl Marx. In their view, Belgium had to suffer for the general benefit of humanity. The Germans, as their professors and socialist leaders proclaimed, had to organize the rest of civilization. And the amazing thing is that these fanatics of culture are accomplishing their self-imposed task. They are not carrying it out in the way they intended, but they are certainly forcing their culture by the power of the sword upon the rest of Western Europe. Britain, for instance, is being compelled, lest she be defeated, to organize under state control her chief industrial and distributing activities. What Germany slowly accomplished in 2 generations, we have been constrained to carry out in 8 months. The hostile great state was so perfectly organized as a fighting whole that Britain and France have had to suddenly model themselves upon her in order to cope with her. The German coal, iron, and metalworking centers were gradually welded into a practical department of the state. There was the rise of trust magnates, the creation of rings controlling output and prices, and acting together in the conquest of foreign markets. Then, the German government took to supervising them, helping their export trade and linking them with the general financial system. They were, besides, firmly controlled in the clashing interests of the peasant classes, the best soldier stock. All these things took many years to accomplish. But, in a month or two, Mr. Lloyd George has had to reorganize and manage our machinery of credit and finance. All the railways were at once taken over by the government. Certain trades were annexed, and more were transformed under official supervision. Difficulties in regard to various necessities of life, such as coal and bread, increased the popular demand for socialistic control. Then, Mr. Lloyd George, that busy man, had to form a committee to run all the factories and workshops supplying, or capable of supplying, the needs of the Army and Navy. Thus, we began to practice the veritable culture, chiefly under the direction of Mr. Lloyd George, who had introduced the German scheme of old age pensions into our once sternly individualistic kingdom. In all probability, the fate of the German will be similar to that of the Greek and the Jew. His idea will triumph, while he and his nation will fail. If ever he becomes a disinterested disciple of his own culture, that wonderful amalgam of the Greek idea and the state as interpreted by Hegel, as developed by French and British communists and Lassalle and Marx, then reduced to practical politics by Bismarck, the German will perhaps be satisfied. For good or for evil, he has forced us into his mold. Even as he transformed the movement of religious reform into a matter of practical politics by showing kings and princes the spoil awaiting them in the rich possessions of monks and nuns, so has he converted us to his ideal of the great state by a very clear proof of its tremendous power in war. By defeating the Germans, we are manifesting the larger triumph of the German idea. We must like it or lump it. That article was by Edward Wright, and I can't find an archive of it anywhere online. The first article's view of Germany, World War I Germany, as a socialist state becomes particularly interesting in light of the second article, The Soul of the Modern Hun, by Austin Harrison. Much has already been written on the state of mind of the German people, that national egotism which has created and set working their wonderful war machine and turned 3 continents into a vast charnel house. This mental perversion of a nation of 70 million people is the most startling phenomena in history, and one which will continue to engross the world long into the ages of posterity. In view of the current interest in this momentous subject, the editor of The War Illustrated is pleased to be able to offer his readers the following analysis of the German soul by Mr. Austin Harrison, the eminent literature author of the Pan-German Doctrine and editor of the English Review. The soul is a difficult thing to define unless we use it metaphysically. And when we speak of the soul of a people, we certainly do not mean that gossamer thing which is supposed to emanate from our bodies after death and soar into heaven. But Goethe wrote blithely of 2 souls and 1 thought, and what he evidently implied were the 2 kinds of spirits or animus which govern our wills and actions, often in complete variance with our conscious thought. Most men have two souls, even as they have two loves, and most nations also. What soul, it may be asked, can the Huns have, seeing that they have assaulted civilization with an utterly soulless cynicism and savagery? I think, if we accept the definition of soul to be animus or spirit, it can be said accurately that the soul of Germany is war. During the many years I lived in Germany, in which period, as a journalist, I traveled over all parts of Austria and Germany, saw all kinds of men, high and low, even grew up, as it were, in the German mode of thought. During those 10 years, I don't ever remember to have heard a German speak with anything but enthusiasm about the right and glory of war. Whereas here we judge a man by certain qualities that wear well, qualities of the heart, of character, of nobility, of action. The German estimates a man in the first and last instant in his capacity as a soldier. Here we speak of pluck. In Germany, they speak of technique. We single out our sportsmen and most gallant gentlemen, and are inclined to slobber over them. The Germans assume the quality of courage, and they call it the berserker spirit, the heritage of the Goths and Huns, of the Hohenzollerns, and the mark of the Brandenburg. They regard it as their peculiar mission to be revealed through Prussia and the King of Prussia to a less warlike Europe. The spirit of Deutschland über alles. Soul with the Germans is thus essentially a terrestrial animus, artificially and cynically associated with divine inspiration. The old Greeks had it, unquestionably, but they were pagans. They loved beauty. They had the noblest sense of perspective in the world. Now the Germans have no perspective. There is nothing beautiful in modern Germany. Their ideals are mundane. Their ideas are utterly selfish. For the last 30 years, no truly great or noble thought has come from the center of Europe. To find any similarity with the German spirit, we must go to the Romans, the Caesars and proconsuls of Rome. The German instinctively possesses the Praetorian spirit, just as the Hohenzollern rulers instinctively regarded themselves as emperors by divine right. The German bureaucratic system must be very like the old Roman system. Their Landräte, or provincial justices, are the exact model of the Viscounts of old. Civis Romanus sum, the emperor once said in a notable speech. He meant he spoke as Caesar, that he wished his subjects to regard themselves as the old Romans, conquerors and possessors of the world. Indeed, it has been for years one of the Kaiser's pet hobbies to restore old Roman camps. The restoration of the Roman Saalburg Castle has been carried out with extraordinary ingenuity and historical fidelity. A people thinking of themselves as Romans cannot be expected to have much of a soul, spiritually interpreted at any rate, and surely no people are less spiritual. The German stands foursquare on his legs. He thinks cynically, he acts cynically. His god is the worship of force. Nearly all the professional strong men are Germans, for example. In Germany, the gymnasium takes the place of our cricket and football. All over the empire, there are singing societies, which, in reality, are national clubs united by song. Since Sedan and Bismarck's day, a totally new conception of life has animated the people, well called the philosophy of valor. It has nothing to do with adventure, romance, chivalry, poetry, such as the discovery of the North Pole. It is a purely radical idea, based upon the frustrated ambition of the past, united through arms to realize the future. The coarse dream of world conquest, patriae inserviendo consumor, was Bismarck's favorite motto, and probably no man in modern history was ever more worshipped by a nation. The Bismarckian spirit penetrated into every homestead in the fatherland, and found expression characteristically in massive monuments and effigies in stone placed in every town and marketplace of the empire, much as the old Goths sought expression in their Gothic cathedrals. Horrible, huge, ugly monstrosities of a blatant art. These Bismarck statues revealed the soul of fighting Germany as no words can. They epitomize the strong, coarse fierceness of a people set upon defying the world, consciously and inherently barbarians. Old Nero was a poor fiddler compared with Moltke or Kaiser William, and Caesar a mere pacifist. No nation ever in history went to war with so gay a conscience, with feller or more sinister intentions. When the World War was proclaimed in Berlin last August, there was not a German man or woman who did not think that at last the day of German world conquest had come, and did not rejoice at the thought. But for our intervention even today, the German aim would have been consummated. We thought the Germans were a nation of philosophers, merchants, tradesmen, chemists, scientists, hagiographers, bacteriologists, and professors leading the spiritual and contemplative life, and so they are. What we failed to see is that in design and purpose, they had become a nation of soldiers. Carlyle taught us to laugh at smell fungus. Today, we find him with his poisonous gases in our trenches. While we were dreaming of international Goethe, the Germans were arming for nationality. When we thought of Sartor and Precantian mummies, the Germans had indeed got into their uniforms tailors all for the fashioning of empire. We mocked the spirit and forgot the clay. German savagery and discipline. Real Germany is quite different. There are more young girls raped in Germany in a year than in all these islands in 30 years. There are more cases of assault and battery in 6 months than in this country in 5 years. An indescribable roughness and brutality characterize the Germans in all classes on a perfectly defined principle of corporal punishment. The way boys are flogged in schools would have astonished even our Dr. Squeers. Horses are beaten on every possible pretext. It is supposed to be the right thing to lash a horse unmercifully if it stumbles. In the army, the men are treated literally with rods of iron, and the suicides in the army are notorious. An absolute license reigns about sexual matters. Bebel, the socialist leader, once said that nearly all shop girls were living on prostitution. To this must be added the pathological symptoms which generally accompany brutality. The cult of homosexuality, sadism, and all kinds of physical perversions reflected in modern German fiction, and quite particularly in the femitarious beastliness of the German comic press. Their so-called new art is saturated with this morbid obsession. In the last 10 years, the spread of venereal diseases, of morbid plague spots, of crime of all kinds, of dishonesty, of roguery, of suicides and defecations, of lust and brutality, have engaged the attention of many doctors and sociologists, and yet have rather been encouraged than legislated against. It is Germany in being, men told the Inquirer. Germany breaking out en route for European hegemony. In the lower classes, socialism, or the gospel of physical force, did not tend to lessen the evil. It may be said truthfully that Germany, in the early part of last summer, was like a people gone mad with vanity and mortal error. And yet, Germany has a soul, the soul of fighting. There is nothing amateurish about this. The qualities demanded are courage, strength, blind obedience, ruthless determination, technical skill, and self-sacrifice. These qualities the Germans possess. They are of their bone and blood. They are the tradition of their history as the warlike people, fighting always for their country in the center of Europe. It is the German special boast that they face facts. They do, and they are able because New Germany started with a clean state, and with a definite purpose before her, to win to her natural boundaries, the mouth of the Rhine, the route via Constantinople to the east, and the reclamation of what they call the Germanic peoples, such as the Flemish, the Swiss, the Dutch, and the reality of European power. There is no cognizance in Germany, such as the French Declaration of Liberty, Equality, and Fraternity. Individualism plays no part in German life. They have nothing of the Russian Nichevo, or don't care. Their altar is a Mars. When the Kaiser invokes the blessings of the Almighty, he implies himself. The Germans follow him because they believe in their own purpose and nationality and their power to enforce them. And that too is a soul, the soul of patriotism. Even if in its application and philosophy, the spiritualism of machine guns is not to be found in the text of most copybooks. So there you have it. World War I was a battle against socialism and homosexuality. That to defeat them, we'd have to become them. And, well, hey, look where we are today.